You could say it all started with a horse, not the clashing of swords, not war cries echoing over the steppe, but a wiry, dust-colored foal that refused to be tamed. Our general? Not yet a general? Not even a soldier? Just a scrappy boy with more fire in his eyes than meat in his belly. Was barely 7 when he first tried to mount that creature. The foal kicked, bucked, threw him onto the hard-packed earth, then snorted as if laughing at him. But the boy, he got up, spat blood, and tried again. That's the thing about growing up Mongol. You learn real quick that the land doesn't care if you're tired, the horses don't pity your bruises, and the wind, it just keeps on howling, indifferent to your pain or pride. The grass that teaches grit. Picture it, the vastness of the steppe, stretching farther than a child's imagination. No fences, no walls, just the sky above, impossibly wide, and the land below, a living, breathing thing. The grass underfoot wasn't just grass, it was a teacher. It taught resilience. Every winter it froze, every summer it scorched, and yet it always returned. So did the boy. He came from a humble ger, a round felt tent that puffed out smoke through a small chimney in the roof. Inside, it was warm, close, filled with the scent of boiling mutton, wood smoke, and sometimes horse sweat, when the animals had to be brought in during snowstorms. Family wasn't just important, it was survival. Everyone had a role. His mother churned fermented mare's milk into airag. His older brother practiced bow shots with arrows longer than his arm, and his grandmother told stories of the great warriors of old, men who rode like lightning and struck like wolves. The boy listened, and he remembered. Not just play, training in disguise. Now, to an outsider, it might have looked like children playing, racing horses, wrestling in the dust, shooting arrows at birds mid-flight. But make no mistake, this was training. Play was just war with softer edges. And he was good at it. Too good, some elders murmured. There was something about his eyes, like he was already watching the future unfold and daring it to challenge him. You know how some kids are told they're destined for something big? He wasn't told. He just knew. But even that kind of knowing doesn't stop hardship. His family, like many others, wasn't powerful. They were herders, scraping out a life where the sky ruled more than any Khan. When his father died from a poisoned stew at a tribal council, their status dropped like a stone into a river. Enemies circled, friends faded, hunger came knocking more than once, and yet every morning the boy woke up, pulled on his fur-lined boots, and trained, with sticks if there were no weapons, with rocks if there were no arrows, with grit if there was nothing else. The first blood. They say a boy becomes a man the first time he draws blood that isn't his own. He was 13, ambushed by older raiders while herding sheep. He had a dull knife, a fast pony, and rage. He lost the sheep, but not the fight. One of the attackers limped away, bleeding and cursing, and word spread faster than fire on dry grass. It wasn't the cut that mattered. It was the message. This boy wasn't prey. That was the start of it. What shapes a general? Now, we could argue. Was it the endless winds, the loss of his father, or the bone-deep hunger that shaped him into the man he'd become? Maybe. But truthfully, it was everything and nothing. It was the steppe itself. It's not a land that raises men. It tempers them like steel in a forge. It strips you down to your will, then asks, "Still standing?" And he always was. They called him Temujin, though history remembers him better as Genghis Khan. Back then, though, he was just a man with a vision, a hard, relentless man, yes, but not yet the thunderous legend etched into the bones of the earth. Word of him traveled across the steppe like smoke on wind, and not just the usual stories. These had weight. A former outcast uniting tribes, a warrior who didn't care about bloodlines, only loyalty, a man who punished betrayal with fire and raised the loyal on horseback. You didn't ignore that kind of noise, especially not when you were a teenage boy with blood on your blade and something to prove. A message on horseback. It started with a messenger, a wiry man riding a horse that looked half starved and half myth. He bore the black horsehair standard of Temujin's rising clan. Riders like this were a rare sight back then. You knew the wind had changed when one showed up on your land. The message wasn't a request. It was more like a challenge. Come, ride under the banner, or be left behind. So he went, left his mother crying by the Gia's hearth, left his little brother clutching a bow too big for his arms. No long goodbyes. That wasn't the Mongol way. Just a saddle, a blade, and a storm building inside his chest. First glimpse of the Khan. He expected greatness. What he found was grit. Temujin wasn't draped in silk or riding a golden steed. He wore wool, dust, and a stare that felt like it could slice through iron. His tent was plain, his guards lean and alert. But what struck our young warrior most was how people looked at him. Not with fear, but something closer to reverence. Or maybe awe wrapped in discipline. There were no long speeches. Temujin didn't believe in wasting words. He simply looked him over, this lanky teen with a patched tunic and a quiet rage, and nodded. Ride. And that was that. Training for war that would rewrite the world. You'd think life got easier once he joined the ranks. It didn't. Training under the Khan was like being thrown into a bonfire and expected to walk out sharper. Days started before the sun and ended when your arms couldn't hold a bow steady. Horseback archery, formation riding, survival drills. Every man was expected to learn everything. No pampering, no shortcuts. They ran mock battles across open fields, where the only reward for winning was water. Miss a target, you'd go without food that night. Complain, you'd ride until your legs bled. But there was something intoxicating about it. The camaraderie, the rhythm, the feeling that, for the first time in your life, you were part of something bigger, something that moved like a living beast across the land. Brotherhood in the saddle. He found brothers in the strangest places. A thick-armed herder from the Orkhon Valley who never stopped smiling. A former bandit with a scar across his throat and a sense of humor darker than a moonless night. And a woman, yes, a woman, who could ride circles around them all and shoot an arrow straight through your pride. They shared fire, fought side by side, and bled for each other without asking questions. That's how Mongol loyalty worked. Once you were in deep. And they all rode for Temujin, because he didn't rule with fear. He ruled with belief. He didn't ask, "Are you of noble blood?" He asked, "Will you stand your ground when it counts?" For men raised under an unfeeling sky, that meant everything. First campaign, baptism by fire. It came fast. One spring, as the snow melted into rivulets that fed the rivers, the Khan called them to ride. A neighboring tribe, one that had betrayed him years earlier, was to be dealt with. No politics, no negotiation, just retribution, swift and cold. Our young warrior, still barely a man, was placed in the forward unit, not as punishment, but as test. And it was ugly. The screams, the smell of blood on dry earth, the chaos of war. It shattered illusions. He'd imagined glory. What he got was noise, mud, and the terrifying truth that men die stupid, quick, and dirty. But he held his line. He fired his bow until his fingers bled. He watched a friend fall and didn't flinch. By dusk, the tribe was scattered, burned, broken, and Temujin stood among the ashes, unmoved. "Remember this," he said to them all. "Mercy is for later. First, they must know who we are." That night, they feasted in silence. No songs, just the cracking of bones and the low hum of wind. And our general, still not yet a general, stared into the fire, his hands shaking slightly, his mind racing. Not with fear, but with understanding. This was what he was built for. Promotions didn't come with ceremonies in the Mongol army. No parades, no polished medallions, no dramatic drum rolls. What you got was responsibility, and if you failed, it was taken away just as quickly, usually along with your head. Our warrior, still young, still half-carved from stubbornness and grit, was named Arben Noyan, commander of 10. Not much, right? Just 10 men. But in Mongol culture, 10 men could burn down a village. 10 men could scout, raid, and vanish like smoke. So if you were trusted with 10, it meant you had something rare, the ability to lead without needing to shout, and the guts to kill without needing to boast. Leadership, the Mongol way. Now here's the thing about leading Mongols. You can't just order them around. These were men who had survived wolves, famine, and betrayal. You had to earn them. And he did, slowly, quietly, by sharing food, by taking the worst shift on night watch, by giving credit and taking blame. He didn't speak more than he needed to, but when he spoke, his men listened. He had that calm kind of authority, the kind that didn't puff its chest or bark commands. It simply existed, like a boulder in a river. His men started calling him Baatar, warrior. It stuck, the art of smoke and sand. The Khan's army wasn't about brute force. It was about brains disguised as brawn. The Mongols mastered deception like it was a family trade. You know those stories about entire enemy armies surrendering before a single arrow was fired. That wasn't luck. That was strategy. Our Baatar learned the tricks, the feigned retreats that lured enemies into ambushes, the false campfires to confuse scouts, the habit of carrying several tunics to seem like there were more soldiers than there really were. Psychological warfare, before anyone had a fancy name for it. And he loved it. Not because it was sneaky, but because it was smart, efficient. Mongols didn't waste lives. Every arrow counted. Every maneuver had a purpose. Moments between wars. People think the Mongols only existed in battle. But honestly, some of the most memorable moments happened between the killing. There was a night when the steppe was calm, eerily calm, and he sat around the fire with his 10, eating half-burnt goat meat and telling stories. One of his men had a singing voice like cracked leather, and they let him hum while they chewed. Someone brought out fermented mare's milk that was a little too sour, and they drank anyway. That was the night he told them about the foal, the one that kicked him down and made him get back up. They laughed, harder than he expected, and one of them, an old archer with more scars than teeth, said, That's the kind of horse we all need to be. It stuck too. The day the arrow changed his life. It wasn't a grand battle, just a skirmish, one of many. A border tribe had taken offense over grazing land, and arrows flew before words could. But on that day, a higher-ranking officer, a Zun Noyan, commander of 100, took an arrow to the thigh and fell. Chaos started to brew. The line was breaking. And Baatar, he didn't wait for permission. He rode in, took command, rallied the panicking men with a voice no one had heard him use before. It wasn't loud. It was sharp, clear, like steel slicing through fog. They pushed back, won, and when the dust settled, the wounded officer, bleeding and half-conscious, looked up and said, "You're going to lead more than 10 men." By nightfall, he was Zun Noyan, from 10 to 100, and it hit him. Leadership wasn't about commanding. It was about carrying weight. Others couldn't. He didn't celebrate. He didn't brag. He just saddled up, checked his men's wounds, and sharpened his blade under the moonlight. Whispers among the warriors. His name began to travel, not loud, not sung by bards, but whispered in fireside circles. There's this young commander, doesn't talk much, rides like a shadow, fights like he's got nothing to lose. It wasn't just fear that followed his name, it was respect. In the Mongol world, that was gold. Even the Khan had heard, and that mattered, because Temujin didn't hand out power for show. He gave it to those who could carry his vision, those who could strike without asking twice, and think while doing it. And Baatar, he was becoming exactly that. But power, like fire, needs careful tending. Too little, and it dies. Too much, and it burns everything you've built. And storms were coming. You know how some winters aren't just cold. They're cruel. The kind that seems personal, like the sky itself is testing your bones. That year, the snow came early, heavy, relentless. It swallowed the grass, froze the rivers solid, and turned the steppe into a quiet white battlefield. But it wasn't just the cold that made it brutal. It was what it uncovered. The siege from within. See, armies are tested in war, sure, but they're made in hunger. Supplies were stretched thin, horses grew weak, men whispered in corners. Some began to question Temujin's campaign. Others grumbled that too many battles were being fought, too many tribes angered. Our Baatar, now commanding 100, trusted, rising, was caught in the middle. One night, a fellow Zun Noyan pulled him aside, a grizzled veteran, older, respected. His tone was low, careful. He didn't speak of rebellion outright, but the implication hung heavy. Maybe the Khan is reaching too far. Maybe it's time for a different kind of leader. One of us. Baatar didn't respond. He just stared, quiet as frostbite. But inside, he burned. Loyalty isn't convenient. That night, he didn't sleep. Sat by the fire, staring at the red-orange glow, licking at the cold air. He could have stayed quiet, could have let it slide, could have even joined. No one would have blamed him. But loyalty isn't loyalty if it only stands in comfort. That's not loyalty. That's convenience. So, before the next sunrise, he rode alone through the ice to the Khan's tent. He didn't name names. That wasn't his way. But he made one thing clear. Something is festering. Watch your men closely. Temujin didn't react, just nodded. That was worse than shouting. The test of trust. A week later, the Khan summoned Baatar and gave him a choice that wasn't a choice. There's a supply caravan, days south. We need it. I'm sending you and 30 of your best. It sounded simple, but the unspoken truth, the route was crawling with enemies, snow-choked, wolves, bandits, no backup, a death mission cloaked in logistics. And Baatar knew this was the Khan's way of saying, you say you're loyal, prove it. He accepted without flinching. Into the blizzard. They left at dawn, breath fogging the air, hooves crunching over brittle frost. 30 men, no banners, no songs, just eyes squinting through snow and hands frozen stiff around reins. The cold was merciless. One night, a man's fingers turned black. Another lost a toe. Still, they pressed on. They fought off a raiding party of desperate hillmen, using what little strength they had left. Baatar didn't sleep. He couldn't. He rationed meat, tended wounds, and kept morale alive, with nothing but presence. When they reached the caravan, it was worse than they'd expected. Half the guards were dead, the rest barely standing. The wagons were stuck in frozen mud, and yet they moved it. Took 5 extra days, but they brought it back. All of it. What loyalty earns. When they returned, the camp was hushed. No cheers. Just wide eyes and disbelief. No one thought they'd make it. Most had written them off as gone. Temujin stood waiting. Said only one thing. You ride not for me. You ride for what we are building. That was it. But from then on, Baatar wasn't just a commander. He was trusted, watched, respected, and feared. Because in Mongol culture, a man who comes back from the dead, who walks into the teeth of a storm and returns stronger, is no longer just a man. He's something more. The steppe had raised him. Its winds had toughened his skin. Its silences sharpened his mind. But now he was being asked to ride beyond it. You see, once Temujin unified the tribes, the question shifted. It wasn't can we survive anymore. It became what's next? And the answer to the Khan was simple. Everything. The edge of the known world. The orders came fast. The armies would ride east toward the Xixia and Jin dynasties, powerful Chinese kingdoms with fortified cities, massive walls, and armies that numbered in the tens of thousands. To many, it sounded suicidal. Mongols weren't siege warriors. They were horsemen, plains fighters, hit-and-run tacticians. But Temujin didn't care what made sense. He cared what was possible. Baatar, now commanding a Mingan, 1,000 men, was given his first foreign command. Secure the mountain passes, flank the Jin reinforcements, and bring back intelligence. It was like being handed a scalpel in the middle of a sword fight. But he didn't hesitate. Into the unknown. Crossing into foreign land felt like crossing into another world. The air was heavier. Trees grew thicker. The soil wasn't the familiar dust of the steppe, but dark, moist earth. And the people, different faces, different languages, different gods. But war felt the same. His first battle on foreign soil was near a river bend, ambush style. His scouts had reported a Jin patrol moving with too much confidence. Probably thought the barbarians wouldn't dare ride this deep. They were wrong. Baatar positioned his archers in the trees, set decoys in the open, and when the Jin approached, cocky and loud, he struck. Quick, clean, no wasted motion. The survivors didn't even make it back to report. Adapting or dying. This wasn't the steppe. The tactics had to change. They learned to fight in forests, tight, confusing, loud, no room for galloping charges. They learned to take towns, not just raid camps. They studied siege engines, borrowed from the Chinese, improved with Mongol precision. Baatar oversaw the first use of smoke signals to coordinate movements between scattered units. His men used local guides, bribed captured enemy officers, and even disguised themselves in Jin armor to sneak into enemy garrisons. It wasn't just warfare anymore. It was chess, played with blood, and it suited him. The siege of Yinchuan. It was the biggest campaign they'd seen. The city was massive, ringed with high walls and moats, defended by elite troops. The Khan brought his best. Baatar's unit was tasked with cutting off escape routes and capturing fleeing nobility. The siege lasted months. Winter came. Supplies grew thin. Morale wavered. At one point, a Jin general sent a message. "Your horses can't climb walls." Temujin read it, laughed, and sent back a reply. "No, but we can starve you until your own people climb down and open the gates for us." And that's exactly what happened, but not without loss. During one night raid, Baatar lost over 100 men. Archers picked them off from rooftops. He carried one of his wounded lieutenants, barely 20, eyes wide with fear, on his back, through firelit alleys. He wept that night, quietly, alone, then got up, washed his face, and began drawing new maps, because grief had a place, but not in front of your men. Loot, lessons, and lingering questions. When the city fell, it was chaos, fires, screams, riches spilling from storerooms, silk, porcelain, gold, things Baatar had never imagined owning. His men gorged, drank, took, and Baatar, he watched. Then he rode out past the city walls, sat beneath a crooked tree, and stared at the stars. Was this what it was all for? The hunger, the blood? He didn't have an answer. But the next morning, he returned, saddled his horse, reassembled his men, because answers could wait. The campaign could not. There's something most people don't talk about when they talk about conquest. They'll speak of battles and banners, of empires and treaties, but not the aftermath, not the silence that follows. Baatar had begun to notice it, not just the smell of blood on his tunic that wouldn't wash out, but the deeper stain, the one on the soul. Ghosts in the wind. They rode through villages with no names anymore, places so scorched and broken that even the birds had abandoned them. Charred wood, empty wells, the faintest hint of perfume or spice from overturned carts, now crawling with flies. Sometimes he'd spot a child's toy left behind, a single shoe, a thread of silk fluttering from a branch. The Mongols were known to burn what resisted and spare what surrendered. But even mercy in war isn't soft. It's just less sharp. Baatar found himself watching the faces of survivors, those they'd spared. They didn't scream. They didn't beg. They just stared. And that stare, it was worse, because it said, "We remember. We won't forget." And deep down, part of him hoped they wouldn't. War on repeat. The campaign didn't end with one victory. It never did. New cities, new enemies, new languages shouted in panic as the Mongol cavalry descended like thunderclouds. Every victory came with cost. Men lost, sleep missed, conscience eroded bit by bit. He began to feel it in his bones. Not weariness exactly. He was too hard for that now. It was something else, like dragging a heavy shadow behind him. He started to write. Nothing formal, just scratches on bark or etchings in leather. Lists of names, not nobles or generals, just the men he'd lost. Ishun, chest wound. Galt, poisoned bread. Bayamar, disappeared in the mountain pass. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't even meant to last. But he kept doing it, like stacking stones over graves no one would visit. A visit from the Khan. One evening, back at camp, quiet, the smoke from dinner fires barely curling, Temujin rode in alone. No guards, just him and his pale stallion. He dismounted, sat beside Baatar, and passed him a strip of dried meat. They chewed in silence. The wind whistled like a flute made of ice. Then the Khan said, almost absent-mindedly, "How many have you buried?" Baatar didn't answer. "I ask because I forget," Temujin continued, "and I can't afford to forget, but I do." He paused. "Do you still count them?" Baatar gave the faintest nod. The Khan grunted. "Good. Someone should." It was the only time they spoke of it. But that night, Baatar slept with fewer nightmares. The things they brought back. Loot, of course. Always loot. Fine fabrics. Painted ceramics. Coins so soft they bent in your hand. Even books, though few could read them. But they brought back other things too. Diseases, languages, songs, new ways of cooking meat, curiosities, and whispers. Whispers that the Mongols weren't just barbarians anymore. They were something else now. Something the world hadn't seen. An idea. You couldn't reason with an idea. Couldn't kill it. You could only kneel to it, or be consumed. Baatar wasn't sure how he felt about that. But he rode anyway, because the road didn't stop, and neither did the orders. The steppe taught them how to ride. The mountain passes taught them how to endure. But it was the cities, the ones wrapped in stone and pride, that taught the Mongols patience. And patience, that wasn't exactly their favorite virtue. Horseman meat, brick and mortar. The city walls were like insults carved into the land, thick, towering, smug. They said, "Stay out," without saying a word. Behind them lived men who believed the Mongols were nothing but dust and galloping hooves. Wild things. Temporary. Baatar had seen enough to know. Those walls were not invincible, just slower to fall. The Mongols learned, quickly. They hired Persian engineers, captured Chinese siege masters, studied how to take down gates without losing too many lives. It was strange, really. These men who grew up worshipping open skies were now sketching blueprints for wooden towers and digging tunnels beneath stone foundations. Adaptation wasn't optional. It was life or death. Siege warfare, dirtier than it sounds. Don't let history books fool you. Sieges weren't noble, and they definitely weren't clean. They were starvation dressed as strategy, disease as a dagger. Baatar hated them, not because they were hard, he could handle hard, but because they were slow, and slow meant watching people unravel. He once watched a city eat itself, literally. The defenders held out for 90 days. On the 91st, the gates opened, not from surrender, but because someone inside had opened them in exchange for a crust of bread and a whispered promise of survival. They lied, that someone didn't live long, but the gates opened. Baatar never forgot the sound, iron hinges groaning open like a dying man's last breath. He never forgot the smell either. Burning oil, human rot, mouldy grain. Victory never smelled clean. Walls that couldn't stop fire. There was a city, he never wrote its name down, where the defenders dumped boiling water and oil on anyone who got close. They had catapults, archers, and pride stacked as high as their towers. Temujin didn't flinch. "We'll turn their fire back on them," he said. And they did. Baatar watched as they built a crude pulley system on top of a nearby ridge, using stolen silk, branches, and the broken remains of a previous city's gate. They launched flaming pots of tar back at the city, used dead livestock to spread disease, lit the walls until the night looked like sunrise. The city fell on the 5th day. That was fast. They buried it on the 6th. That was final. What civilization taught the conqueror? It wasn't all destruction, though. You'd be surprised. Inside those walls were ideas. Baatar walked streets paved with stone for the first time in his life, saw aqueducts that bent rivers to serve men. He met merchants who spoke 4 languages and monks who claimed to read stars like scrolls. And he listened. Maybe that's what set him apart. He didn't just destroy, he observed, remembered. He had a habit of pocketing small things, glass beads, scraps of parchment, pieces of architecture drawn in charcoal. He'd sit by the fire and sketch what he saw, asking himself, how did they build this? Why? Because someday this knowledge might be useful. And besides, you couldn't conquer the future by riding backward. A memory that stuck. One city, rich, beautiful, with gardens and libraries, fell in autumn. And as the gates opened, Baatar saw a boy, no older than he had been when he first tried to tame that wild foal. The boy wasn't crying, just watching. Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not fear, not hatred. Something like recognition. A moment later, one of Baatar's men shouted, and the moment shattered. He never saw the boy again, but every time he rode past a smouldering ruin, he thought of him and wondered, what will he become? Now, here's something they don't put in the old war scrolls. It wasn't just the blade that built the empire. It was the bond, the ones forged not in courtrooms or temples, but over cracked ribs, spilled wine, and shared frostbite. For Baatar, war was only half the job. The other half, politics, Mongol style, and that was something else entirely. Sworn by blood, not paper. In the steppe, you didn't sign treaties. You drank from the same bowl of horse blood. Disgusting, maybe. Sacred, absolutely. That kind of oath was permanent, more binding than law, more terrifying than death. To break it was to curse yourself, and worse, your horses. Baatar had sworn a few of these oaths, some with men he'd fought beside, others with rivals who'd proven themselves too useful to ignore. One, in particular, stood out. His name was Targudai, a thick-necked brute of a man, son of a warlord who once tried to kill Temujin. Targudai was everything Baatar wasn't, loud, impulsive, always reaching for his blade before his words. They hated each other at first, but over time, that hatred cooled into something harder to define. They'd saved each other's lives too many times, and when they finally spilled blood together in battle, it sealed a bond neither of them could walk away from. At a winter feast, they drank fermented yak milk until their laughter turned into coughing, and they pressed wrists together over the fire, swore to fight back to back, never to draw steel against the other. They kept that vow, mostly. Brotherhood isn't simple. Here's the truth. Loyalty isn't easy when the stakes get bigger. As Temujin's power grew, so did the cracks in unity. Tribes that once followed out of fear now wanted reward. Ambitious generals began forming little courts of their own. The old steppe simplicity, ride, fight, feast, was becoming politics. And politics? It was a kind of war that didn't use arrows. Whispers spread. Deals were made in shadows. Promises traded like coins. Baatar hated it. He understood command, understood fear, but flattery, manipulation, the cold smiles of men who sharpened words like knives. It didn't sit right, but he had to play the game. He started learning, watching who sat where during feasts, noting who poured whose drink, remembering which warriors never looked each other in the eye. And slowly, without meaning to, he became part of it. Betrayal feels like a knife. You forgot, you owned. It came from within. A junior commander, under Baatar's command, someone he'd once fed during a harsh winter, someone he trusted, was caught selling secrets to a rival tribe that had bent the knee but still burned with resentment. The betrayal wasn't strategic. It wasn't even smart. It was petty. Greed. When Baatar confronted him, the man didn't beg. He just said, "You don't understand what it's like, always in your shadow." And maybe, in some small way, Baatar did understand. But that didn't stop the sentence. The next morning, the man was executed publicly. Baatar didn't watch. Couldn't. He just stood with his back to the wind, arms folded, while the crowd fell silent. Later, he drank alone. Didn't sleep. Scratched another name into leather. Not because he missed the man, but because he didn't want to forget what trust felt like before it broke. Temujin's lesson. Some days later, the Khan summoned him. "You did what was right," Temujin said. "It didn't feel right. Then you still have your soul. That matters. Keep it." Then, a pause, the kind that carries weight. But don't ever let it get in the way. That was the moment Baatar realized. Compassion was allowed. But it was a luxury, one he couldn't afford often, and certainly not twice. Funny thing about legacies, they never arrive when you're ready for them. They sneak in, like a winter wind under your gear flap, uninvited, quiet, but impossible to ignore. For Baatar, it wasn't a crown or a title that made him think about what he was leaving behind. It was a boy, the son he didn't expect. She was a healer, quiet hands, sharp eyes, steady voice. Her name was Saikan, not a woman of the court, not a noble's daughter, just someone who knew how to mend things, bones, wounds, hearts maybe. They crossed paths after a brutal campaign in the east. Baatar had taken a spear through the thigh, not deep enough to kill, but just enough to sit him down for 2 weeks, fuming like a caged wolf. Saikan changed his bandages without flinching, said little, listened more, and when he barked at her once, frustrated and sore, she just raised an eyebrow and said, "You fight armies, but whimper like a foal at stitches." He smiled for the first time in days. They didn't speak of love. Mongols didn't write poems about such things. But months later, she gave birth to a boy. Strong lungs, stubborn grip, eyes like his father. And suddenly, Baatar found himself staring into a future he never prepared for. Not a battlefield, a boy, teaching a different kind of discipline, raising a child while riding with an empire. That's like trying to hold on to water during a storm. But Baatar tried. He didn't teach his son to pray, didn't care much for gods. He taught him to ride bareback before he turned 4, how to shoot from the saddle at 5, how to track wind changes, read hoof prints, listen to silence. He told him, a real warrior doesn't always look for the fight. He listens for the moment when it's worth it. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't say, was that every piece of advice he gave felt like he was handing off his own history. Not a legacy wrapped in silk, one wrapped in blood and dust and lessons paid for in other men's lives. Seasons that weren't about war. There were moments, fleeting ones, that weren't about campaigns or enemies. He remembers a spring when the steppe exploded in color. Flowers poked through the snowmelt. His son found a tortoise and named it Iron. They rode together to the ridge and watched hawks circle. No war drums, no strategy, just 2 generations and a sky big enough to hold them both. It almost felt like peace. But peace is tricky in the Mongol world. It never sticks. A summons came days later. Another campaign, another king to dethrone. And Baatar, reluctantly, handed his son to Khan with a nod. He's ready, he said. Khan replied, you say that like you're not coming back. I'm always ready not to. She didn't cry. Mongol women rarely did. What legacy really means. On the ride back from that campaign, a long one, brutal, too many losses, Baatar asked himself a question that had no good answer. What will he remember me for? The victories, the stories, the absences. Would he understand why his father chose duty? Why he kept returning to the sword, even when he wished, secretly, to lay it down? Baatar didn't want to be a ghost his son admired. He wanted to be a man he understood. But understanding, that takes time. Sometimes a lifetime, sometimes longer. They say the wind of the steppe carries news faster than any rider, and by the time it reached Baatar's ears, the message was clear. The Khan wanted the West. Not just the kingdoms near the mountains, but far, far beyond. Past the Oxus River, past Persia, toward lands whispered about by traders in riddles and spices, lands of silk and gold and stubborn kings who scoffed at Mongol messengers. You could almost smell the arrogance before you even crossed the border. And that was dangerous. The diplomats who didn't return. It started with peace, or something like it. Temujin, now officially Genghis Khan, ruler of all Mongols, sent envoys. A gesture, formal, respectful. Let us trade, the message said. Let us be neighbors instead of enemies. The Khwarezmian Shah didn't just reject the offer. He killed the envoys, shaved their heads, sent one back mutilated as a warning. A warning? To Genghis Khan? That wasn't a message. That was a match dropped in dry grass. And the steppe? The steppe doesn't forgive. Riding into dust and fire. The Western March was unlike anything Baatar had ever seen. Longer rides, thinner air, desert winds that scraped skin raw, entire days without water. The men grew irritable, the horses restless, but they kept going. Why? Because they weren't marching to fight. They were marching to make an example. Every soldier knew it. Every commander breathed it. The punishment of the Khwarezmian Shah would be so complete, so ruthless that no ruler from the Danube to the Ganges would ever again question a Mongol's word. And Baatar, he was leading a Tumen now, 10,000 riders under his command. He carried that number like a weight on his chest. Cities with names that choked: Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur. Beautiful names, like poetry in the mouth. But when Baatar reached them, they were anything but soft. High walls, endless markets, libraries filled with scrolls. They were cultural giants, sophisticated, ancient, rich beyond reason, and arrogant. They mocked the Mongols, called them dust spirits, said they'd melt under city stone. Instead, they burned. Baatar coordinated the siege of Nishapur. It took weeks. The defenders were clever: boiling oil, hidden tunnels, false gates. But nothing stops a Mongol when he's on a mission. When the city finally fell, Baatar stood over its gates, sword still dripping, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The punishment was complete. But something in him shifted. He had grown up thinking cities were symbols of pride. Now he saw they were also cages, built to look safe, until someone brought fire, traders, treasures, and tensions. The Silk Road was more than a name. It was a vein of the world, pulsing with gold, glass, jade, slaves, rumors. As the Mongols moved west, they didn't just crush armies. They took everything that moved: camels, coin, cooks, scribes, and ideas. Baatar began hearing about people called Franks who rode armored beasts, about black-clad assassins who swore oaths to mountaintop fortresses, about sultans and popes and crusades. He realized the world was bigger than he'd ever imagined, and the Mongols were now in it, not just threatening it, not just skimming its edges, inside it, the toll it took. But conquest has a price. The farther they rode, the thinner their roots became. Soldiers fell, not just to arrows, but to heat stroke, infection, bad water. Baatar lost his voice for 3 weeks after a sandstorm lodged grit deep into his throat. He lost 2 lieutenants in a single ambush. They were good men, honest, not political climbers, just warriors. That night, he didn't give a speech. He just sat by their empty saddles, drank alone, and watched the stars burn overhead. And for a moment, he thought, when does it end? But morning came, and with it, new orders. Because the Khan's hunger didn't shrink, and neither could his. By now, Genghis Khan wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else: myth, force, ghost, god. The kind of name people whispered, even when they were alone. The kind of figure that made enemies surrender before a single arrow flew. And Baatar had ridden beside him, fought for him, bled beneath his banner for years. But you know what no one ever talks about? What it's like to serve someone whose legend grows faster than the man himself, living under a giant. Temujin had always been a towering presence, brilliant, cruel when necessary, quiet in a way that made you afraid to speak first. But now he had history behind him. The tribes were unified. The empires trembled. Even the stars, it seemed, bent around his ambition. And for men like Baatar, that meant something strange happened. No matter how many victories you led, how many enemies you broke, how many riders shouted your name, you were still just beneath the Khan. Always. And it wasn't bitterness, exactly. It was gravity. You orbit a star like that too long. You forget your own warmth, the commands that made no sense. As the empire expanded, the orders became different. Baatar was once told to burn a city he'd just spent 3 weeks securing because someone had insulted a Mongol trader 2 years prior. Another time, he was told to spare a noble family after months of fighting because the Khan had decided to arrange a marriage alliance. There were days Baatar wanted to ask why, but Mongols didn't ask why. They rode. Still, something gnawed at him, a quiet ache behind the armor. He began to miss the early days, the simple days, when war was about survival, not ceremony, when loyalty meant sleeping shoulder to shoulder on frozen earth, not navigating court alliances and deciphering the moods of noble advisers who'd never once held a sword. A glimpse behind the mask. One night, deep in the Altai Mountains, the Khan summoned Baatar alone. No guards, no pomp, just the two of them, sharing salted yak meat and watching the fire crackle. "You've served longer than most," the Khan said. Baatar nodded. "I've trusted you to lead, to kill, to spare. You've done all of it, no complaints." Still, Baatar said nothing. Then Temujin turned, eyes more tired than fierce. "Do you ever wonder what it's all for?" That was a question no one expected from Genghis Khan. Baatar stared at the fire a long time before answering. "I used to think it was for the land, then for the people, then for you. And now?" He shrugged. "Now I think it's just what I do, because I don't know what else I'd be." Temujin smiled. Not big, just enough to shift the wrinkles on his face. "That's the trick, Baatar. You ride long enough, you become the saddle." They both laughed, and for 1 hour the Khan wasn't a god. He was just a man with sore joints and too many regrets to count. The burden of being known. As his fame grew, Baatar noticed something new. Silence. Not in war, but in friendship. Men stopped challenging him, stopped teasing him, stopped calling him foal boy or the stubborn one. They called him Commander, the Iron Rider, Baatar of the Thousand Flames. He hated it, because it meant he'd lost something. He was no longer among the men. He was above them, and the higher you climb, the colder the wind. But still, he rode. Not for glory, not even for the Khan anymore. He rode because his name had become a story, and he wasn't done writing the end. Peace is a funny thing. Most men crave it, dream of it, talk about it like it's some warm, distant fire waiting at the end of the road. But for Baatar, peace was uncomfortable. It itched. It rattled in his chest like a loose arrowhead he couldn't quite dig out. Because when you've spent most of your life preparing for the next campaign, the next betrayal, the next cold night with blood still under your nails, stillness doesn't feel like safety. It feels like forgetting how to breathe. The pause that didn't last. After a string of brutal Western campaigns, Genghis Khan called a temporary halt. Not surrender, not retreat, just a breath to consolidate, count horses, reorganize command. For the first time in years, Baatar wasn't moving forward. He was waiting. He returned to the central steppe, to the vast grasslands that still looked like his boyhood, though he no longer fit them the way he once had. The wind still sang, the clouds still rolled like armies of their own, but the world had changed, and so had he. Home, but not the same. He returned to Saikan's tent in the early hours. She was outside, feeding the fire, her expression unreadable. His son, now 10, was already saddling a pony, eyes darting between his parents, unsure whether to salute or just run into his father's arms. They did neither. Instead, Baatar handed him a bow. "Show me." The boy's form was good, not perfect, but steady. He loosed an arrow at a distant post, hit low. Baatar nodded. "We'll work on that." That was the closest he came to saying, "I missed you." Saikan, standing nearby, said softly, "You don't have to be a soldier here." He looked at her for a long time and replied, "Then what would I be?" She didn't answer, because there was no answer, not for a man like him. Quiet battles. In the months that followed, Baatar tried to settle. Truly, he did. He taught his son how to care for a wound without flinching, how to read the twitch of a horse's ears, how to listen to the wind for signs of change. He mended broken leather, repaired arrows, slept in a warm bed, but his hands wouldn't stop twitching at night, gripping at phantom reins, reaching for blades no longer at his side. And dreams came, sharp, broken ones, of cities burning, friends falling, a boy with eyes like his who stood alone in the snow. There were days he'd walk to the edge of the pasture and stare east, imagining a fire in the horizon, not hoping for one, just expecting it, because warriors don't believe in endings, only pauses. A visitor from the south. One evening, a rider approached the camp, dust-caked, fast, and obviously official. He wore the Khan's colors. Baatar didn't move, just watched from his stool, hands stained from repairing a saddle. The rider dismounted, bowed. "Word from Karakoram." Baatar raised an eyebrow. "There's unrest in the south. Some cities have grown bold. The Khan is forming a new command. He requests you." Not commands. Requests. That was rare. Saikan was standing at the doorway of their gyre. She didn't say anything, just looked at him. And Baatar, he felt something strange. He didn't want to go. Not really. But when the sun set that night, he began sharpening his blades. Because peace, real peace, wasn't a fire waiting at the end of a road. It was a fire within that he couldn't quite put out. There comes a moment, not marked by horns or banners, when a warrior realizes something simple and terrifying. He no longer needs to prove himself. No one tells you when it arrives. It's not a ceremony. It's a quiet shift, a different weight to the sword in your hand, a different look in the eyes of younger men who salute you not with rivalry, but reverence. Baatar felt it on a cold morning, before a campaign he hadn't asked for, summoned to a war he didn't believe in, under a sky that looked exactly the same as it did when he was 16. Only now he was tired, not in the legs. Those still rode strong, not in the hands. They could still string a bow with ease, but in the heart. That part had miles on it. The South burns again. The rebellion in the southern provinces had festered for months. Puppet kings refusing tribute, defectors arming city walls, whispers of alliances with Persian dynasties. It wasn't unexpected. Success breeds resentment faster than failure. But the truth? Baatar didn't care about politics anymore. He rode because it was asked of him. because duty, once embedded deep enough, becomes indistinguishable from breath. The young commanders under him were eager, loud, wide-eyed. They called him Father of Storms now, a name passed between units like a holy phrase. He hated it, because a storm destroys everything, even the things you love. One last campaign. This campaign felt different. It lacked purpose, not in the tactical sense. There were plenty of objectives, of course. Cities to break, messages to send, borders to redraw. But he didn't feel the fire. He led with the same precision, the same economy of motion. But inside, the silence was growing. At one village, the enemy surrendered before a single sword was drawn, and Baatar, dismounting, looked around at the wide-eyed villagers, the young men too scared to meet his gaze, and for the first time in his life, he said, "Spare them. No fire." His men blinked, confused. One asked, "But the Khan's orders." Baatar cut him off. "The Khan asked me to lead, not to follow blindly." And no one questioned him, because when a man like Baatar speaks like that, you listen. That night, they made camp outside the village. No looting, no screams, just silence and soup. It was the warmest night they'd had in weeks. The arrow that wasn't fired. The final skirmish of that campaign came near a narrow gorge, flanked by ridges thick with brush. The enemy had archers, hidden and well-positioned. The trap was obvious. Any advance would mean slaughter. Baatar held the line, surveyed the hills, and then, slowly, deliberately, he rode forward alone. No shield, no banner, just him. Arrows knocked, but not released. The enemy watched, unsure. He stopped at shouting distance, pulled an arrow from his quiver, raised it to the sky, then snapped it. Just a crack, nothing dramatic, and turned his horse around. That's all. The message was clear. We could kill you, but we won't today. Not because we can't, but because we no longer need to. The enemy melted away by nightfall. His men were baffled, but Baatar, he slept soundly. Not the end, but an echo. He returned to the steppe, not with a limp or a wound, but something heavier, completion. He still trained, still rode, still corrected his son's aim, and grunted at Khan's knowing smirks. But he didn't lead any more, not in battle. Instead, he taught. He sat by fires and told stories, not grand ones, honest ones, of men who missed, of mistakes made, of friends lost, and horses remembered. He passed on his bow to his son quietly one day. No ceremony, just a nod. "You'll know when to use it," he said, and walked off toward the ridge. The wind was soft that morning, no urgency, just presence, and in that stillness, for the first time in decades, Baatar didn't feel like a warrior. He just felt like a man. Stories are strange things. They begin with people and end with places. The man fades, the mountain remains, and if you're lucky, your name becomes part of that mountain. Baatar never set out to be remembered. That wasn't the Mongol way. You fought, you served, you died. If someone sang your name later around a fire, well, that was their business. But names like his, they tend to outlive the man. The last ride. He didn't die in battle. Not on a horse, not with a sword in hand, not beneath a banner or flame. He died in his sleep, one cold spring night, beneath firs, with a half-carved bowstring still in his fingers. No screams, no sickness, just a final exhale, like the wind leaving the steppe. Some said he saw the sky split before he went. Others claimed he whispered his horse's name. There were even rumors that Genghis Khan himself, old, tired, and somewhere far, paused that night and simply knew. No one really knows. But in the morning, his son found him, still, calm, almost smiling. And that was how the man known as Baatar, the storm father, the quiet fire, the rider of 10,000 dusts, left this world, not with war, with rest, what the steppe remembers. He was buried simply, no monument, no golden tomb, just a small cairn of stones, built by the hands of his son, his wife, and a few men who had once called him brother, with more truth than blood. His saddle was placed atop the stones, his sword buried beside him, and over time the grass grew. Then the wind erased the trail, but not the presence. Riders still pass near the ridge where he once stood, and horses sometimes shudder for no reason. Birds avoid the tree line, and on especially quiet nights, when the moon is low and the air tastes of iron, old men say, "Ride quiet, Baatar watches still." What is a legacy, anyway? It's not statues. Those fall. Not gold. That melts. It's not even stories. Not really. Because stories twist, get retold, warped by time and wine and ego. A legacy is simpler. It's a lesson passed from father to son, from warrior to apprentice, from a commander to the one kid who never thought he was brave enough, until he was. It's the idea that you can fight with honor, that loyalty doesn't need noise, that rage can serve something bigger than itself, that even in a world ruled by steel, a quiet man can shape empires. Baatar never ruled, but his shadow touched every kingdom the Mongols rode through, because every soldier who ever marched behind him carried a little piece of his code, even if they didn't know it, especially then, dust to dust. Eventually, the empire changed. Genghis Khan died. The sons argued. The world shifted. Maps were redrawn. Cities rebuilt. But the steppe, it stayed. And sometimes, if you ride out far enough, past the villages, past the carved stones and forgotten trails, you'll find a place where the wind moves just a little differently. A place where the grass grows tall and still, even in winter. And if you listen hard enough, you might hear hooves in the distance. Not many, just 10. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of Arabia. A single system, a single banner, over nearly a quarter of the world's known population. Historians will tell you it was Genghis Khan's vision, and they're right. But visions don't build themselves. They're carried on the backs of horses, in the calloused hands of men like Baatar, men who never wore crowns, but made sure others could. His hand in the map. Look closely. A caravan route across Central Asia, safe for the first time in a century. Baatar's scouts cleared the bandits. That merchant town that never resisted again after one brief siege. His unit spared it, not out of mercy, but calculation, and it became a hub. Those soldiers trained in flanking tactics the world had never seen. His designs, his drills. He never asked for credit. But if you lay the map flat and trace your finger across the paths of Mongol expansion, you'll start to see him. He's there, just behind the headlines, in the shape of the roads, the silence after conquest, the faces of the men who carried the empire forward, the men who came after. Generals rose after him, famous ones, more ambitious, more political, some brilliant, others just loud. But none of them had that particular stillness. You know the kind. It's like standing beside a mountain that doesn't try to be impressive. It just is. That was Baatar. He became a reference, a way to measure others. Steady, like Baatar, they'd say. Or, he doesn't panic, must have trained under the Iron Rider. It became common, then cliché, then forgotten, but the measure stayed, even when the name didn't. The places that still speak. Somewhere on the Silk Road, in a village with no signpost, there's a stone with faded script, no grand inscription, just a few etchings in Old Mongol. He rode far, but never away. A passing scholar once copied it into his journal and speculated it was a poem. It wasn't. It was just the truth, a quiet one, like him. And far to the north, in the valley where horses still outnumber people, some children still train with small bows made in a certain shape, slightly curved, tighter grip. The old herders call it a Baatar curve. They don't know why. They just know it works. The empire ends. The rider remains. Empires fall. They always do. No matter how vast, no matter how terrifying. Time swallows cities. Politics rot the roots. Gold rusts. Trade routes shift. Even the memory of fear softens into curiosity. But the way a man carries himself, that can last. And that's the thing about Baatar. He never cared about building a dynasty. He didn't seek immortality. But immortality, ironically, tends to find the men who don't want it. So maybe, just maybe, when someone thousands of years from now rides across the steppe and hears the wind moving through tall grass, they'll feel something. Not fear, not glory, but steadiness, like a reminder that once, long ago, a boy tried to ride a wild foal and refused to fall. Epilogue. In the dust between legends, there are stories that shine too brightly. They blind you with names like Alexander, Caesar, Genghis. But between those legends are quieter lights. People like Baatar, not the thunderclap, but the deep rumble that follows. Not the sword, but the steady hand that sharpens it. And honestly, maybe that's the kind of greatness we need more of. Not louder, just truer. So the next time you hear hoofbeats in your dreams, or feel the wind shift on an open plain, pause a second. You might be standing in his shadow, not beneath it, beside it. Centuries pass, languages shift, borders dissolve and reappear, flags change, coins lose their worth. But a story like Baatar's, it finds ways to survive, even if you don't hear his name. A sword that was never reforged. Somewhere in a private collection, hidden behind glass, under low museum lighting, a curved Mongol saber lies quietly. It's not ornate, no gold, no jewels, just practical, worn grip, slight notch near the base of the blade. Historians argue over its origin. The museum plaque calls it Mongol, circa 13th century. That's it. But if you ask the old Mongolian caretaker who dusts the display, he'll tell you, lowering his voice just slightly. It belonged to one of the quiet ones, the ones who didn't take cities. They held them. He doesn't say Baatar. He doesn't have to. You feel it in the steel. It's not famous, but it lasted. And in a world obsessed with headlines, sometimes lasting is the greatest rebellion. Bloodlines and broken horses. Some say Baatar's bloodline ended with his son. Others insist it continued, quietly, through generations of herders, bowmakers, and border guards, men and women who didn't rise to power, but refused to bend to it either. There's a rumor of a Kazakh nomad living in the 1800s who shot a Russian officer clean off his horse at 300 paces. His name? Bayat, son of Baatar. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. Legacy doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves like a shadow, or a wind that smells like home. In the language of horses, equestrians in Central Asia still use a phrase, Baatarian Algatai Mori, a horse with Baatar's imprint. It refers to horses that are calm under pressure, not wild, not slow, just steady, grounded. They say those horses carry the memory of being ridden by someone who never pulled on the reins in fear, only in understanding. They say those horses can tell if you're lying. You either ride with purpose, or you fall. Sounds like nonsense? Maybe. Or maybe it's just what happens when an entire region's soul is shaped by one man's quiet way of commanding the wind. We tend to study conquerors like they were philosophers. We quote their speeches, etch their strategies into leadership seminars, turn their deaths into page-turning climaxes. But sometimes the real lessons don't come from the generals who spoke the loudest. Sometimes they come from the one who didn't speak at all. What Baatar knew that we've forgotten. Pride slows you down. He never needed to yell, never needed to be first through the gates. His pride was in precision, not noise. Grief isn't weakness. He mourned his men. He remembered names. He buried with hands, not orders. Revenge isn't always strength. Sometimes he chose not to burn, not because he was soft, but because he was done. You can lead without owning. His legacy isn't in his bloodline, it's in his example. A horse will never lie to you. Enough said. What the modern world could learn. We spend a lot of time today celebrating force, speed, outperformance. We call things conquests, without knowing what real conquest costs. But Baatar's story reminds us that the strongest man in the room might not be the one shouting. He might be the one listening, the one sharpening a blade he'll never need, the one who doesn't post, doesn't posture. He just shows up, day after day, ride after ride. No audience, just purpose. If you ever get the chance, whether you're lost in travel or chasing silence, go to the steppe. Not the tourist version, the real one. Wide as thought, cold as truth, warm as memory. Bring a bow, even if you can't shoot. Sit by a fire, even if you're alone. And when the stars come out, sharp, endless, and unapologetically ancient, listen. Not for music, not for voices, but for hooves. Just 10, far in the distance, moving not toward war, but toward whatever comes next. It's easy to talk about one man, one hero, one legend, but Baatar never rode alone. Not really. So let's pause the history for a moment. Let's sit by the fire and speak of the 10 who rode beside him. Not all the names are remembered, but the feeling of them, that still clings to the wind. Erkan, the laughing blade. He killed more enemies than anyone in the first campaigns, but what he was remembered for was his laugh. Loud, ragged, always inappropriate. They said he laughed at his own wounds, even when bleeding out. Baatar buried him under a cedar tree, never spoke about him again. Sali, the scout, small, fast, quiet as smoke, never seen, never missed. She once rode 100 kilometers ahead of the army with only a knife and a handful of dried meat, and returned with a map inked in blood and charcoal. She vanished after a campaign in the north. Some say she joined a monastery. Others say she just rode farther. Baatar always left a space for her in formations, just in case. Jodo of the Orkhan, big, gentle, fought only when asked, spoke rarely. But when he did, even the horses stopped to listen. He once carried a wounded Baatar 2 days on his back, died protecting the supply line at Nishapur. The line held. His saddle still hangs in a tent near the river. Tegan, the story keeper, couldn't shoot straight, barely rode well, but remembered everything. Birthdays, horse names, the number of arrows fired in each battle. He kept a running tally of lives saved, not taken. Baatar gave him a special task, to write it all down. No one knows where his records went, but maybe this is part of it. The forgotten. Not every name survives, but their shapes do, in how Baatar fought, in how he listened, in how he led, because no man becomes a mountain without being shaped by the wind around him. And those 10, they were the wind. There's no written doctrine of how Baatar led, no scroll, no oath. But if you ask the men who trained under him, years later, broken or graying or halfway across the world, they tell you the same things. Because his code didn't need words. It was felt. Rule 1. Eat last. No matter how hungry, no matter how cold, he always fed his men first, even if that meant half a bone and broth for himself. Leadership to him was never about being served. It was about serving. Rule 2. Speak less, ride more. He didn't like speeches, said they were for people who needed convincing. Instead, he'd ride, up the line, down the line, a nod here, a hand on a shoulder there. Presence mattered more than noise. Rule 3. Never waste anger. Rage could win a battle or lose a war. He taught restraint with no sermons, just calm eyes, and silence when others shouted. If he raised his voice, that meant the world was ending. Rule 4. Trust the horse first. Men lied. Maps could be wrong. But a horse's ears. They heard what you didn't. He once turned an entire column around because his mount stopped mid-step. Hours later, they discovered an ambush site just beyond the ridge. The men didn't question him after that. Rule 5. Die if you must, but never lie. His orders weren't always easy, but they were clear, and he never sent a man somewhere he wouldn't go himself. That kind of honor is rare, which is why, even now, Mongol warriors tell their children, don't fight like a lion, fight like Baatar, quietly, until it's over. The steppe didn't raise fragile people. It couldn't afford to, and that's why Mongol women, so often left out of the war scrolls and chronicles, were never fragile. They were the spine of the jur, the planners of food, the caretakers of warriors, the negotiators, the traders, the whisperers behind the throne, and sometimes the real rulers, just without the horsehair banners. Saikan wasn't the only one. Baatar's wife, Saikan, wasn't some rare exception. She was part of a pattern the world kept overlooking. When the men rode off to battle, it was the women who kept the herds alive, managed the resources, taught the children to ride, shoot, survive, handled trade with caravans, negotiated local disputes. They weren't waiting for their men to return. They were building something worth returning to. Letters without ink. There's a phrase in Mongol that roughly translates to words sent through wool. It refers to how women communicated without needing paper, through stitching, through shared supplies, through past objects with subtle meanings. Baatar once received a fur-lined saddle blanket sewn in a specific pattern, a symbol Khan had used years before, when a sickness had swept through their herd. He knew immediately. Illness was near the homestead again. He turned his men, sent medicine, sent help, all from one square of cloth. That was intelligence, and it didn't come from generals. It came from someone who had never raised a sword, but never needed to. The daughters who knew the bow. You think only sons learn to shoot? Think again. Baatar's daughter, Turmajin, was born with lungs like thunder and hands like ice. She once rode straight into a line of wild goats, loosed 2 arrows, and returned with meat before her older brother had finished saddling his horse. He never caught up to her after that. She never went to war, but she trained every child in their clan how to fire from horseback while hanging sideways from the saddle, just like the elite riders did. Temujin never saw a battlefield, but every warrior she trained did. The great Khan's mothers, even Genghis Khan himself, owed his rise to a woman, his mother, Hoelun. She held the family together after Temujin's father was poisoned and the tribe abandoned them. She fed them roots, begged from strangers, fought off raiders with a knife made from bone. And when her son rose to power, he made sure no one ever doubted the strength of his mother's name. Baatar often said the same thing about Khan. She never rode beside me in battle. She stood while I was away, and that takes more strength than most men can carry. Empires have spines, not just swords. The Mongol Empire may have been built by warriors, but it was held by women. They were the keepers of memory, the singers of the old songs, the passers of values. When the world cracked open in blood and conquest, they were the ones sewing it back together, quietly, relentlessly, without fanfare, just like Baatar. Maybe that's why they fit so well together. When you think of Mongols, you probably think of galloping horses, scorched earth, and unstoppable conquest. But here's something the textbooks skim over. The Mongols didn't just destroy, they built. Not palaces necessarily, not cathedrals or colosseums. They built roads, and that, perhaps more than anything else, changed the world. The yam, the artery of an empire. It was called the yam, a relay system so vast and efficient it rivaled anything the Romans had done centuries earlier. A web of mounted couriers, supply stations, rest points, and communication hubs that could stretch from the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea and not lose a single message. Think about that. You're in Karakoram. You need to send an urgent dispatch to Bukhara. With the yam, it gets there in less than 2 weeks. On horseback, across deserts, through mountain passes, past rivers that could swallow armies. And the message arrives, unbroken, unchanged, unbelievable, but real. Baatar's role in the web. He didn't invent the yam. That credit goes to the Khan and his administrators, but Baatar helped make it function. He was assigned to secure a section of it during his late years, a 1,000-mile stretch between the Altai Mountains and the northern edge of Persia. That stretch included 4 major postal stations, dozens of rest stops, with fresh horses every 30 kilometers, 2 fortified waypoints manned by archers in case of rebellion. Baatar personally rode the entire route in both directions, twice, before approving it. When asked why, he simply said, "You can't protect what you don't know." He trained the couriers himself, taught them how to ride in snow, read enemy hoofprints, sleep while in the saddle if needed. They weren't warriors, but they mattered more than most warriors ever would. Messages that moved empires. Through the yam flowed more than orders. It carried trade records, marriage proposals between distant nobles, maps, spies' reports, grain tallies, cries for help. In time, it also carried stories, ideas, religion, music. A Buddhist monk in the East could write a letter to a scholar in Samarkand. A doctor in Persia could send a new treatment recipe to a healer in Mongolia. And none of this required a scroll to last. All it needed, a rider and a road. And maybe that's what made it magical. The roads today. If you stand on certain stretches of land in Central Asia, open plains, silent hills, you might not see the yam, but walk far enough, and your feet will follow the packed earth where thousands of hooves once pounded. There's a kind of energy still lingering there. People don't notice it, but horses do. They move differently, like they remember, and sometimes, if you're quiet, you can still feel the pulse beneath the soil, like a whisper. Ride fast. The message must get through. You'd think an empire built on horseback wouldn't care for scrolls. And yet, the Mongols, those riders who tore through cities and shattered kingdoms, often chose not to burn libraries. They used them, they read them, and in some cases, they saved them. Because for all the tales of destruction, and yes, there was plenty, there's another truth sitting quietly behind the smoke. The Mongols didn't fear knowledge. They wanted it. The book Baatar kept. Baatar, you'll recall, wasn't a man of ceremony. He wasn't a scholar. But late in life, he began carrying a single book in his saddlebag. No one knows exactly what was in it. Some say it was a copy of a Persian medical text. Others claim it was a Taoist treatise, gifted by a Chinese general after a surrender. A few believe it was simply a family ledger, filled with names and stories of the 10 who first rode with him. Whatever it was, he never let it out of reach. And that says everything. He once told a young warrior, "Ink lasts longer than blood, but both can mark the world." Mongol tolerance for ideas. Unlike many empires that enforced a singular faith or worldview, the Mongols didn't. Genghis Khan himself had a shaman, but he also employed Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, Taoists, and Confucians in his court. If you could serve, you were welcome. And your ideas? They were studied. Mongol rulers invited astronomers from Baghdad, engineers from China, poets from Persia, philosophers from India, not as trophies, but as tools. Knowledge was like a weapon or a saddle. You didn't have to invent it to use it. The scribal networks. In the post-conquest cities, One of the first things Mongol administrators did, after installing a governor, was set up record keepers, trade documents, agricultural records, military logs, translations of local laws into Mongolian, and vice versa. They didn't just conquer bodies, they conquered systems, and that required understanding them first. You don't tax what you don't measure, and you don't rule what you don't record. The libraries, they didn't burn. Yes, some libraries fell to fire in moments of rebellion, vengeance, or accident, but many more were protected. When the Mongols took Baghdad in 1258 under Genghis Khan, the famed House of Wisdom was said to have been destroyed, but records also show that Mongol commanders took pains to protect its scholars and move texts to new cities. In Samarkand, Bukhara, and later Karakoram, libraries were rebuilt, scrolls recopied, scholars relocated and given stipends. Baatar, during one late campaign, famously ordered a captured scholar not to be executed, despite pressure from his subordinates. "Kill him," they said. "He insulted the Khan." Baatar replied, "Words can insult, but this man carries maps in his head. Let him draw them." He did, and those maps guided 4 future campaigns, the legacy of ink. Today, when we talk about the Mongols, we talk about what they destroyed. But here's the secret. They also stitched a torn world back together, page by page. They connected scholars across continents, preserved texts that would have otherwise been lost to local wars, translated languages into one another, letting Arabic meet Chinese, letting Latin kiss Mongolian. And all of that happened because someone in armor valued ideas as much as iron. Baatar knew it. He wasn't a reader, but he made sure the readers survived, because even the strongest sword dulls eventually. But knowledge, that sharpens itself, before the thundering of hooves, before the empire, before the names carved into banners and bones. There was the horse, and there was the sky. The Mongols never needed temples. The steppe was the temple, the wind, the priest, the fire, the altar, and the horse. The horse was everything, more than a beast. To call a Mongol's horse a mount is like calling the sun a light bulb. It was more than transportation, more than muscle. It was breath, rhythm, memory. A Mongol child would ride before they could properly walk. They learned balance not from lectures, but from movement, saddle to sky to saddle again. And in that riding, something spiritual emerged. The horse became a mirror. If you were anxious, it bolted. If you were calm, it flowed. Baatar used to say, "A man who cannot sit with a horse has no business sitting with men." And he meant it. Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Above it all was Tengri, the sky god, vast and eternal. Tengri was not worshipped with chants or kneeling. You didn't plead to Tengri. You respected him. You rode under him. You didn't lie with Tengri watching. He was the sky itself. And if your cause was just, he would hold back the storm, or so they believed. Genghis Khan himself claimed he ruled by the will of eternal blue heaven, and few dared question that. Baatar believed too, but not loudly. He never shouted prayers, but you'd find him some mornings, just before dawn, standing quietly, face turned to the heavens, lips unmoving, listening, not asking, just listening. Spirits in the wind, The steppe was full of shamanic breath. That's what the elders called it. Spirits that rode the wind. Ancestors. Memories. Warnings. A sudden shift in wind direction. A spirit passing. A horse refusing to ride west on a particular path. That wasn't disobedience. That was guidance. Men like Baatar didn't argue with signs. Once, before a major battle, he halted his entire column because a crow landed on his lead horse's neck and screamed 3 times. No one questioned him. That night, scouts found a hidden enemy ambush lying in wait up the road. The column slept safely under the stars. Rituals that didn't need books. Spiritual life in the steppe wasn't structured. It was felt. Before major rides, warriors rubbed ashes on their foreheads. After victory, they poured fermented mare's milk into the earth, a drink for the spirits. When someone died, their belongings were burned or buried with them, so their spirit wouldn't wander in search of them. Baatar's own saddle was offered to the fire after his burial, but legend says the flame refused to consume it, so they buried it instead. And some say the wind around that grave still smells of leather and sweat, like the horse is still waiting, the space between life and death. Mongols didn't fear death. They respected it. They treated it like a guest. Unwanted, maybe, but polite. When Baatar's men fell, he never spoke their names for a full moon, not out of superstition, out of silence, out of letting the wind settle. Then, when the time was right, he would speak them again, clearly, once. Then ride on, because that's how you honored the spirits. Not by clinging, but by carrying them with you, quietly, with purpose. Maps fade, ink runs, borders shift, but the land remembers. And if you know how to read it, really read it, it'll tell you more than any scroll ever could. Baatar knew that. All Mongols did, really, because before they learned to write, they learned to read the earth, not in symbols, in shadows, in wind, in dust. The steppe as a scroll. Imagine a field of tall grass. To most people, it looks empty, wild, unreadable. But to a seasoned rider, it's a story, a patch of flattened stalks. Someone camped there 2 nights ago. A trail with broken hoof prints veering left. A wounded horse limping under a nervous rider. Mud hardened with circular indentations. A wagon caravan passed at dawn. To Baatar, the ground beneath him wasn't background. It was context. It told him what scouts couldn't. It lied less. It remembered more. He once tracked a deserter across 4 ridgelines, using only disturbed moss and water level in hoofprints. When asked how he did it, he just shrugged. The land wanted to tell me. I just listened. Dust, the messenger. Dust was its own kind of speech. It settled differently depending on speed, weight, direction. A thin spiral of dust in the distance, riders moving at full gallop, a low, wide puff, marching column, multiple layers crisscrossing, confusion, panic. Once, before a major battle, Baatar delayed his charge. Everyone thought he'd grown hesitant, but he was watching the dust. It wasn't consistent, too chaotic. "Something's wrong," he said. "They're not ready. They're waiting." Turned out the enemy had set a trap. Archers hidden in the woods, waiting for the Mongols to charge blind. They never got the chance. Baatar didn't need to see the ambush. The dust told him everything. Sky as map, wind as guide. Land wasn't the only thing Mongols read. They understood the wind, its tone, its smell, its message. If the wind shifted cold from the northeast, rain would come within a day. If it carried a sweet scent at night, deer were nearby. If it fell completely still, something unnatural was happening. Baatar used to close his eyes and smell the air before a ride. It wasn't superstition. It was calibration. The wind was the whisper of the world, and ignoring it was like fighting with one ear closed. Terrain as strategy. Unlike other armies, the Mongols didn't build roads. They read the ones nature had already laid. They used valleys as funnels, hills as lookout towers, shadows as shields, snow as a delay tactic. They didn't reshape the world to suit their tactics. They reshaped their tactics to suit the world. And that's why they moved faster, hit harder, and vanished quicker than anyone else. Baatar once redirected an entire force away from a seemingly obvious path. He pointed to a patch of rocks. Too smooth, he said, which meant worn down, used before, possibly booby-trapped. He was right. Behind that rock patch were buried spikes, hidden by rebels. Another 100 men, saved by what most would call just a path. The ground never lies. Baatar trusted a lot of things: steel, silence, his horse. But above all, he trusted the land, because the land didn't flatter, didn't beg, didn't betray. It just told the truth. You just had to know how to ask. And if you listened carefully enough, even the dust would answer back. To outsiders, the Mongol bow was just a weapon, a curved instrument of war, a tool for killing. But to the riders of the steppe, it was something more, something sacred. It wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about understanding yourself, the space between breath and movement, between tension and release. And no one understood that better than Baatar, the bow that became an extension. He didn't name his sword, but his bow, that had a name. Chagan Amiska, white breath, made from sinew, horn, wood, and hide, recurved, compact, lethal, but delicate in its way. Like all Mongol bows, it required maintenance, oiling, respect. You didn't leave it in the sun. You didn't let another man string it without permission. It was a partner, not a possession. Baatar would often string and unstring his bow by the fire, not even looking at his hands. And sometimes, when no one else was around, he'd whisper to it. Not words, not prayers, just breathe, like greeting an old friend, drawing without shaking. Every Mongol learned early. The draw must be silent, the arrow still, the breath controlled. Baatar once trained a nervous young warrior whose hands shook every time he pulled the string. "You're holding your fear," Baatar said, "like it belongs in your fingers." "Where should I put it?" the boy asked. "Nowhere," he replied. "Let it pass through you. Let it leave with the arrow." It wasn't about still hands. It was about a still heart. And you could see it in Baatar every time he fired. The moment before release, he'd go completely still, not just physically, but emotionally, like a pause in time. And then, thwip, the arrow would be gone before anyone saw his fingers move. Horseback archery, the moving meditation. The Mongols were masters of the impossible, firing with precision while riding at full gallop. To many, it looked like chaos. To them, it was poetry. You had to ride with your knees, twist your body sideways without losing balance, time the shot between hoof beats, trust your horse to read your mind. Baatar could hit a pine cone while riding past it at 20 paces. But more impressive, he could do it without looking, just by feeling the rhythm of wind, weight, and motion. To him, it wasn't about aiming, it was about knowing, a kind of instinct you couldn't teach, but could train toward. He used to say, "When your breath and the bowstring sing the same note, you'll never miss. Release, then forget." A Mongol archer didn't dwell on his shots. You let go, then moved on, because looking back, second-guessing, chasing missed arrows, that would get you killed. The discipline of archery taught Baatar how to live, pull cleanly, release without flinching, and whatever happens, don't look back. That's how he lived. That's how he led. And maybe that's why, even in death, no one saw him flinch. Because to Baatar, life was never about how many arrows you loosed. It was how many you could loose without fear. By day, the Mongols were warriors. But at night, they were storytellers. And after a long march, horses resting, weapons cleaned, boots off, and fires crackling, you'd hear it begin. A voice, low, raspy, sometimes tuneless, sometimes haunting. Then another voice, picking up the rhythm. Then a morin khor, a two-stringed horsehead fiddle, gently weeping into the wind. The fire flickered, the sky listened, and the night became something sacred. Music carried the memory. Mongol songs weren't written down. They didn't need to be. They were remembered. Passed from elder to child, from commander to soldier, from a mother braiding her daughter's hair to a rider guiding his herd across frozen valleys. Some were about gods, some about horses, some about women who waited through 20 winters, only to ride to war themselves. And some were about men like Baatar, but his name was never sung outright, just hinted at, like a gust behind the melody, because the greatest warriors, you didn't shout their names, you sang around them. The night Baatar sang. He wasn't a singer. He didn't believe he had the voice for it. But one night, after a victory that came at too high a cost, he sat near the edge of camp, alone, plucking a morin khor left behind by a fallen soldier. He didn't play well, but that wasn't the point. He played anyway. The melody was simple, almost childish, something his mother might have hummed when he was too small to hold a bow, and the sound, cracked, soft, carried by the cold, reached the center of the camp. The men didn't interrupt, they didn't cheer, they just listened, and many of them, hard men, scarred, broken in ways steel couldn't fix, wept quietly. No shame in it. The steppe allowed for that, in the dark. Stories born in firelight. Every camp had its myths. Tales of wolves that turned into warriors. A stallion so fast it outran the moon. A lake where fallen generals slept with swords in their hands, waiting for one last ride. A wind that only visited the tents of the truly honest. These stories weren't lies. They were truths disguised as dreams. And Baatar, though rarely the one telling them, would always sit close to the storyteller, chin resting on his knuckles, eyes reflecting the flames. He never corrected a tale, even the wild ones, especially the wild ones, because he knew those stories held the soul of the Mongol spirit. And sometimes, when reality was too sharp, a little myth softened the edges. After the songs, silence. When the music stopped, it never ended with applause, just quiet. The fire died down. The stars watched from above, and the men returned to their bedrolls, not to sleep immediately, but to feel, to remember, to carry the melody inside their chest a little longer. And in that silence, Baatar would often murmur a final phrase into the darkness. Let the night keep what we can't, because some wounds needed a lullaby, and some memories, they belong to the fire. It's easy to get lost in the noise of conquests, cities burning, horses galloping, banners snapping in the wind. But behind every campaign, behind every hardened warrior, there stood a small, circular structure, not tall, not grand, but stronger than stone in its own way. The gur, sometimes called a yurt, but to the Mongols it wasn't just a tent. It was a world, a portable one, a warm one, a sacred one, a circle that meant something. There's no sharp corner in a gur. Everything flows inward, toward the center, toward the fire, and that's no accident. The Mongols believed that life, like the wind, was circular. You're born, you grow, you fight, you lose, you return, and through all of it, the gur stays round. Baatar once said, "A man can fight 100 battles, but if his gur is crooked, he has no foundation." He meant it literally and metaphorically, because inside the gur, you weren't a general, you weren't a conqueror, you were home, and home levels everything, what lived inside. A proper gur was more than felt and wood. It was a living history, the hearth in the center, where meat boiled and tea brewed, saddles and tack hanging neatly near the entrance, bowstrings drying under hides, a pouch of dried mare's milk, crushed and ready, a family heirloom, maybe a piece of carved bone, maybe a dagger, maybe nothing more than a braid of hair tied in leather. In Baatar's gur, it was quiet, always, the kind of quiet that wrapped around you like fur. Saikan kept it that way, calm, orderly, peaceful, not out of vanity, but because a man at war needs a place without war, even if that place is only 10 paces wide. The way you enter mattered. You didn't just walk into a gur. There were rules. You entered clockwise. You never step over the threshold. You don't point at the fire. You don't sit before being invited. These weren't formalities. They were respect. Even the Khan followed them. And Baatar, he once disciplined a junior officer, not for failing in battle, but for carelessly barging into a family's gur without bowing. "You've conquered nothing," he said, "not even your own pride." That officer never forgot the lesson, nor did the family, the gur that waited. While the Mongol army moved like a storm, the gurs stayed behind, or followed more slowly, with the herds and families. Baatar's gur made more journeys than most. It followed him across deserts, across rivers, across lifetimes, and even when he rode far ahead, it waited, always. The smell of smoked mutton, pine smoke, and sweat always welcomed him back, like it hadn't noticed he was gone. It had, but it didn't say anything, because the jeer wasn't just shelter. It was forgiveness, a space for the armor to come off, for silence to grow loud enough to hear yourself think again, for a warrior to become a father, a husband, a man, after he was gone. After Baatar passed, the jeer stayed standing for a season. His son lived in it for a while. His daughter cooked in it. Saikan sat inside it some mornings and stared at the fire like it might speak. Eventually, it was taken down, the way all jers are, folded, tied, carried, but parts of it were never put away. A beam used in his grandson's jer, a rug stitched into a new saddle blanket, a kettle passed to a neighbor, still blackened with soot from 1,000 dawns. And somewhere, out on the steppe, when the wind rises just right, the smoke still curls upward in a shape that looks familiar, like a memory you can sit inside, warm, round, and waiting. It's easy to think of the Mongols as destroyers. And sure, cities burned, kings fell, entire nations were rearranged like pieces on a board no one else could see. But here's what most forget. The Mongols didn't just tear things down. They rewrote them, quite literally, with a script, with a language, with a system that took chaos and turned it into continuity. The rise of Mongol script. The original Mongols were illiterate, oral storytellers, not scribes. But Temujin, long before he was Genghis Khan, understood something crucial. If you want your empire to survive you need more than armies. You need records. You need communication. You need a script. And so, he borrowed. He took the Uyghur script, vertical, flowing, elegant, and made it Mongol, adapted it, spread it. Suddenly, orders didn't have to ride only in memory. Now, they rode in ink. Treaties could be written, census lists recorded, tax records standardized, decrees signed in the great Khan's name, even when he was 1,000 miles away. This wasn't just administration. This was infrastructure. Baatar's brush with the pen. He wasn't a scribe, didn't want to be. But he understood what written words could do. Late in life, Baatar began keeping small clay tablets and scraps of bark near his sleeping mat, etched not with flourishes, but with facts. The names of the fallen, the number of horses left, the dates of snowfall on the southern passes, not dramatic, not poetic, but useful. He once told a younger commander, "A sword remembers what you kill. A scroll remembers what you kept alive." That commander went on to help codify the Mongol postal system. Coincidence? Maybe, or maybe not. A multilingual empire. The Mongols weren't purists. They didn't force conquered peoples to abandon their own languages. Instead, they adapted. In the empire's prime, you'd find official documents written in Mongolian, Chinese, Arabic, Persian, Tibetan, Greek, Latin. Diplomatic letters were issued with multiple versions to ensure understanding. Translation wasn't seen as dilution, it was seen as power. And through it all, the Mongol script stood quietly in the margins, recording, tallying, preserving. Proof that the steppe could speak in ways that didn't require shouting. Writing as control and compassion. With writing came law. Under Genghis Khan, the Yasa was compiled, a set of legal codes governing theft, betrayal, military conduct, marriage, trade, even hygiene. Much of it wasn't written in the early days, more oral than ink. But as literacy spread among the elite, those rules became written contracts. No one was above them, not even the generals. Baatar once stood trial before a council for executing a captured noble without approval. He didn't argue. He read the law, accepted his censure, and when asked why he didn't resist, he said, "Because if the law breaks for me, it won't hold for anyone." That's what writing gave the Mongols. Not just control, but accountability, and that made them stronger than the empires they conquered. Dust turned into record. The Mongols turned dust into data. They wrote where others would forget. They kept copies where others burned evidence. They sent historians and scribes to follow armies, not just to glorify, but to observe. And now, centuries later, what we know of Baatar, what we feel of him, exists because someone, somewhere, decided that a man without a crown still deserved to be written down, and someone, somewhere, did. Empires fall. That's the rule. Rome, Persia, Egypt, all giants once, now names on dusty maps and decorative souvenirs. But the Mongol Empire, it didn't fall like those. It didn't collapse in a single day, or crumble under its own weight in one fiery moment. It faded, like hoofprints in dry grass, not with a bang, but 1,000 murmurs. It started with peace, not real peace, but the dangerous kind, the kind that whispers comfort into the ears of empires. Borders got harder to patrol. Succession became complicated. Too many sons, too many ambitions. Governors started thinking they could be Khans too. And over time, the great Mongol Empire, the unified thunder of 10,000 hooves, fractured into smaller hordes, each still powerful, each still riding hard, but not together, not like before. And without unity, the echo began to fade. What Baatar would have thought. He didn't live to see the empire fragment, but had he? He probably wouldn't have shouted, wouldn't have written angry letters or raised a new banner. He would have just sat, quietly, watching, because he always knew nothing stays. The strongest warriors fall, the best horses tire, the clearest victories blur with time. And empires, they return to the earth, just like men do. He once told his son, as they watched dust settle after a long ride, "We are not the storm, we're the wind before it, and the quiet after." He knew, even then, the gentle remnants. Today, the Mongol Empire is gone, but if you know where to look, you can still see it, in a style of bow still used by Kazakh hunters, in postal systems that owe their speed to the yam, in the curved rooftops of yurts across Eurasia, in the words Ordu, Khan, Tumen, that live on in languages far from Mongolia, in the Mongolian script, still vertical, still flowing, even in modern statecraft, where tolerance, rapid communication, and strategic alliances are praised. You'll find fingerprints left by those who once rode through fire and wind. You just have to know what you're looking at, what silence leaves behind. The thunder of hooves no longer shakes the mountains, but sometimes, in the early morning, when frost clings to the grass and your breath curls in the air, it's there, in the stillness, in the hush before daybreak, in the memory of power that never needed to shout, and in the sense that somewhere, on some ridge, beneath a sky too wide to measure, a man once stood, hands behind his back, watching it all unfold, not clinging, just noting. The empire didn't fall. It returned home, to the wind, to the dust, to the silence that always follows greatness. Empires rise, they fall, maps bleed and redraw, but beneath all of it, the land stays, and those who learn from it, they carry something the world can't shake. Baatar wasn't a philosopher, not in the way scrolls and schools define one, but he lived his philosophy. One ride, one breath, one choice at a time. And if you really listen to the silence he left behind, you'll hear it. What the steppe taught him. Stillness is not weakness. In battle, in conversation, even in grief, stillness gave him clarity, control. He could sit for hours without moving, eyes fixed on the horizon, while younger men paced and fumed. They thought he was indecisive, until the moment he moved, and everything changed. Because stillness wasn't lack of action. It was choosing the right moment to act. Speak with your actions, not your mouth. Baatar was never loud. His commands were short, his praise quiet, his reprimands colder than steel. But his actions, undeniable. He once rode 2 days through sleet to deliver medicine to a sick village elder. No reward, no glory, no words needed. The elder lived. So did the lesson. Pain passes, regret doesn't. In the rare moments Baatar showed emotion, it wasn't over wounds. It was over decisions he almost didn't make, lives he almost didn't save, kindness he almost held back. He never feared pain, but regret. That haunted him. He taught his son, if you have the chance to do right, don't wait. The arrow you don't fire might be the one that saves someone. No one rides forever. He didn't cling to power. He trained his replacements, gave them space, stepped back when it was time. When asked why, he said, "The horse that refuses to rest becomes the burden." He rode when needed, and when he was no longer needed, he walked. That was his final lesson in strength. Remember, and then let go. Baatar never forgot his first kill, or his first lost friend, or his first fall from a horse. But he didn't live in those memories. He carried them, like stones in his saddlebag. And when the time came, he laid them down, one by one, without shame. Because remembering is how we honor, but letting go is how we survive. If you ever find yourself far from home, on a ridge, in a wind, with nothing but breath and a name in your throat, listen. You may hear nothing. That's the point. The silence you're hearing, that's Baatar, not in the sky, not in a story, but in the pause between moments. And if your heart feels just a little stronger, if your fingers rest easier on the bow, if your horse follows your thoughts without needing the reins, then he's still riding with you, right there, at your side, just like always. So much of Baatar's story has been about war, movement, honor, and silence. But what about the world that shaped him? The stuff between battles, the things that rarely make it into the scrolls? This appendix is for the curious, for those who want to understand Mongol life, not just read about it. Let's walk through it, tent flap open, boots muddy and all. The Mongol day begins with the horse, before prayer, before breakfast, before conversation. The Mongol greeted his horse, watered it, checked its hooves, adjusted its tack. Children as young as 3 were taught to saddle a pony. By age 6, they were racing each other in open fields. By 10, mounted archery. You weren't born a warrior. You rode into it. Meals were simple, heavy, and unapologetic. Protein was king. Boiled mutton was the staple, bones and all. Airag, fermented mare's milk, was the national drink. Tangy, cloudy, potent. Dried curds called arul made good travel food. Sour, crunchy, loud when chewed. Soups often involved what was left from yesterday. Mongols called it recycling. Outsiders called it terrifying. Hospitality was sacred. If you entered a gyr, you were fed, even if the host had little. You ate before you talked. Always. Family was power. Forget nuclear families. The Mongols lived in clans. Aunties, uncles, cousins, second cousins, adopted cousins, blood brother cousins. They all mattered. The gyr wasn't just a house. It was a network, a mobile fortress of relationships. And behind every man in armor was a woman with calloused hands who taught him to shoot, to sew, to think. The empire may have been built by men like Baatar, but it was sustained by women like Khan. Music was memory. Every song had a place. A galloping song, a death song, a fire song, a horse birthing song, a song for when your daughter married and left the valley. Mongols didn't record history with parchment. They recorded it with melody, and they trusted the throat to remember what the mind might forget. Religion was woven into the wind. Tengri, the eternal blue sky, was not worshipped like a deity. He was acknowledged, respected, consulted. Baatar never went to a temple, but he spoke to the sky before battle. The Mongols also welcomed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and shamanism. If your god kept you honorable, fed your horses and didn't lie, you could keep him. Simple as that. Justice was swift but measured. Under Genghis Khan, the Yasa laid out clear laws. No stealing, no lying, no kidnapping women, no showing disrespect in a gyr, no harming envoys. Baatar followed these laws strictly. They weren't just rules, they were identity. Mongol justice wasn't perfect, but it was consistent. And in an empire that stretched from Korea to Kiev, consistency was a revolution. Death wasn't the end, just a turning. When someone died, they were buried in a hidden spot, usually unmarked, with their weapons and a bit of food. No tombstones, no processions, just silence. The idea was simple. Let the spirit rest. Let the land reclaim. Even Genghis Khan's grave is unknown, because Mongols don't point to where a man is buried. They point to where he rode. Mongol warfare wasn't about brute force. It wasn't about throwing bodies at walls or charging mindlessly into a fray. It was about calculation, speed, deception, discipline, patience, and most terrifying of all, precision. Let's break it down. Exactly how Baatar and his fellow commanders turned a nomadic culture into an unstoppable military machine. The decimal system, simplicity that scaled. Every Mongol soldier knew exactly where he belonged, down to the smallest unit. It looked like this: Arben, Deset men, Zun, Hundrede men, Mingan, 1,000 men, Tumen, 10,000 men. Baatar commanded all these units at various stages of his life. The structure was clean, predictable, and scalable. You could form an army of 30,000 in under a day and have every man know exactly who to report to. It wasn't flashy. It was efficient, and efficiency wins wars. Mobility was the religion. Mongol warriors carried 3 to 5 horses each. They switched between them to preserve stamina. This meant they could travel 70 to 100 miles a day, far outriding any enemy. They could encircle you before you even knew they were nearby. They could vanish into the plains, then appear again from a different direction, like ghosts. Baatar once led a feigned retreat for 6 days, drawing an enemy army deep into the desert. On the 7th day, he turned around and erased them because they were tired, and he wasn't. Discipline, the invisible weapon. There were no heroes on the field. No one charged ahead for glory. If a soldier disobeyed a command, even in victory, he could be executed. This wasn't cruelty. It was design. Because Mongol battles were choreographed like theater. A signal meant fan left. A flag meant split into 2. Smoke meant retreat, slowly, then ambush. Baatar drilled his men constantly, even during peacetime. War, he used to say, is just practice done with fire. Archery, the great equalizer. Every Mongol soldier was an expert archer, not competent. Expert. They could hit a rabbit at full gallop. They used composite bows, made from horn, sinew, and wood, stronger than any European longbow, and much smaller. They shot with thumb draws, releasing over their knuckles with fluid motion. An enemy army could be dead before they even got close enough to swing a sword. That wasn't luck. That was technique, married to instinct. Psychological warfare, winning before the fight. The Mongols made fear a weapon. They'd pretend to flee, then turn and strike when pursuit weakened the enemy. They sent fake envoys with misleading terms, then attacked from the rear. They'd leave survivors on purpose, just enough to carry stories of terror to the next city. Some cities surrendered at the sight of dust on the horizon, assuming Mongols were nearby, even when they weren't. Because when your reputation rides faster than your horses, the world moves out of your way. Siege warfare. Yes, they mastered that too. Early on, Mongols weren't great with cities, but they learned. Fast. They hired Persian and Chinese engineers, built catapults, battering rams, towers, and even sappers. They diverted rivers, blocked trade, used fire and disease as tools. Once, they launched plague-infected corpses over walls to trigger outbreaks. They didn't just adapt. They perfected what others took centuries to learn. Baatar personally oversaw the siege of 3 major cities, each with different tactics. He never used the same playbook twice, because war wasn't a game, it was a language, and he spoke it fluently. Victory with purpose. Mongols didn't fight for fun. They fought to expand trade, secure resources, neutralize threats, and build systems. If a city surrendered early, it was spared. Trade continued. Local leaders remained under Mongol supervision. Taxes flowed. Everyone lived. If it resisted, the city ceased to exist. Brutal, Yes, but it sent a clear message. Your fate is your choice. Baatar never gloated after a victory. He didn't have to. The silence left behind spoke louder than any anthem. Dates weren't something the Mongols obsessed over. They measured life in winters, in battles survived, in horses raised, in sons returned. But still, when you're trying to understand a man like Baatar, it helps to mark the moments that shaped him. So here it is, not a list of dry dates, but a living memory of a man whose story stretched across skies, across bones, across silence. Year of the Red Deer, age 0. Baatar is born in a cold valley north of the Onon River. The midwife says he doesn't cry, just opens his eyes and stares at the smoke hole in the gear roof. His mother names him Baatar, warrior, a name given not in prophecy, but in preparation. Year of the rising dust, age 7, first ride without falling. His father, drunk on fermented goat milk and pride, lifts him high onto a tall gelding and says, "If you fall, don't cry. If you don't fall, don't brag." Baatar does neither. He rides, quietly, like it's where he was meant to be. Year of the bitter teeth, age 10. He learns to butcher, a lamb, clean and quick. He cries after. His mother doesn't comfort him. She hands him the heart and says, "This is yours now. Take care of it." He does, even when he doesn't want to. Year of the cracked river, age 14. First kill. A bandit, older, slower, but mean. Baatar fires the arrow clean through the man's neck, then vomits. His uncle tells him, "Good. You should never stop doing one of those two things." Baatar never says which. Year of the empty saddle, age 19. His father dies, thrown from a horse after a reckless bet. Baatar doesn't weep. He gathers his father's gear, buries the blade in the northern pass, and burns the saddle. He says nothing for 3 days. When he speaks again, his voice is quieter, but heavier. Year of the broken bone moon, age 24. First battle under the banner of the great Khan. Baatar commands 10 men. 9 survive. They're promoted together. He keeps their names on a strip of hide in his saddle pouch for the rest of his life, even after most of them are gone. Year of the storm's laugh, age 29. Meets Saikan. He loses a horse race to her. She doesn't gloat. She invites him for tea. He's never more nervous in his life. He proposes 2 weeks later. She accepts, without smiling. That night, he writes her name on the inside of his bow with pine soot and spit. Year of the singing death, age 34. Leads his first major battle, outnumbered 2-1. Wins by forcing the enemy into a valley, then trapping them with fire and wind. Afterward, he doesn't celebrate. He buries the horses that died, then sings, quietly, to the fire. One of the only times his men ever hear his voice in song. Year of the grey flame, age 38. Son is born. He names him Altan, gold. Not because the boy is precious, because he's dangerous, if not shaped. Teaches him to ride, but never forces him to fight. Altan will follow his father's path eventually, but not because he's told to, because he chooses to. Year of the red horizon, age 42. Defends the southern passes against rebellion. Stays awake for 5 days. Loses 40 men. Wins the war. Afterward, refuses a reward from the Khan, says, "If I need more than food, a fire, and a clean conscience, send me to the goats." Year of the soft hoofprint, age 49, steps down from formal command, becomes advisor, travels less, but his shadow still rides in every war council. His opinion is sought, but never demanded. His words land soft, but cut deep. He starts to smile more, but only when no one's looking. Year of the second dawn, age 54. Final ride, not for battle, for peace. Visits a village spared decades ago. The children there now call him Grandfather Baatar. He stays one night, gives away his blade to a quiet girl who can't stop drawing horses in the dirt. Tells her, "You don't need it, but if someone ever tells you otherwise, show them you know where it came from." Year of the listening sky, age 55. Baatar dies quietly in his sleep. Saikan wakes before him and knows immediately. She doesn't scream. She doesn't wail. She lays his hands over his chest, ties a white ribbon around his fingers, and waits for the sun. When it rises, she lights a fire and sings the same song he once hummed beside the battlefield. She doesn't cry until it ends. And when it ends, it doesn't really. Not for her, not for us. This isn't your standard list of translations. Think of it as a campfire conversation, a place where terms aren't just defined, but understood. Every word here meant something in Baatar's life. Every term carried weight. Let's walk through it. GER, a circular, felt-covered tent, the Mongol home. Not a hut, not a shelter, a universe. Symbol of family, mobility, and balance. You entered with humility. You left with warmth. Baatar means warrior or hero, but not the cape-wearing kind. This was the name you earned in quiet moments, when no one watched, when you chose honor over comfort. Fitting, then, that it became his name, Tengri, the eternal blue sky, not a god in the Western sense, more like a presence, omniscient, quiet, always above. To live under Tengri meant to live with clarity, courage, and consequence. Baatar often prayed not to Tengri, but into it, more in core. The horsehead fiddle, 2 strings, bowed, haunting. Its voice was said to mimic the weeping wind, often played at dusk or after a loss. Baatar was never a master, but he held one with reverence. Music mattered, even to warriors. Arag, fermented mare's milk, sour, tangy, slightly alcoholic. It wasn't about taste. It was about tradition, hospitality, hydration. Fermentation was life out on the steppe. If you shared your arag, you shared your soul. Arban, Zun, Mingan, Tumen, the military units. Arban, 10. Zun, Sto. Mingan, 1,000. Tumen, Onbin. No fluff, no confusion. A decimal system that ran an empire. Each layer trusted the one below it, like bones in a body. YAM, the Mongol postal system. Think, relay stations, fresh horses, intelligence moving at record speed, spanned across the empire like veins. Baatar respected the messengers more than most. They risked everything, unarmed. Yasser, the Great Law, attributed to Genghis Khan, covered crime, betrayal, marriage, religion, war, and leadership. Unwritten at first, but it shaped everything, even Baatar. He once said, "A sword may rule a battle, but the yasa rules a man." Khan/Kagan. A Khan was a ruler of a tribe or region. The Kagan, Great Khan, ruled over all Khans, the supreme sovereign. Genghis was the first. Kublai, one of the last to rule as truly universal. Baatar never wanted the title. He wanted to serve it, or do. The camp, the mobile military base, eventually gave rise to the English word horde. Baatar helped build many. Each had its rhythm: guards, cooks, horses, fire circles, but also joy, music, and whispered stories. Kudag, a well. Simple, right? But in the steppe, water meant survival, honor, territory. Baatar once defended a kudag for 7 days, not for gold, for the children who drank from it. Arul, dried curds, hard, sour, long-lasting, carried by riders across thousands of miles. Baatar hated them, but he carried them anyway, because you don't always love what sustains you. Sood, a Mongol warrior's pulse, a phrase used in conversation. I feel his Suda is strong. It wasn't about heartbeat. It was about will. Baatar had a strong Suda, even when the rest of him grew tired. Tolbo, a mark, a stain, a scar, often used metaphorically. He carries a tolbo on his name. Baatar avoided tolbos, not by being perfect, but by correcting quickly. He didn't fear mistakes. He feared ignoring them. Birken, God, but used loosely. A wooden idol, a carved spirit, a symbol of belief. Some warriors tied birkens to their saddles. Baatar carried none. But Saikan said his eyes were his burkan. They always saw clearly. By now, you've heard the hooves. You've felt the wind. You've walked beside Baatar, through blood, through fire, through silence. You've eaten in his ger, held his bow, heard the wood groan beneath his knees at night. And maybe, just maybe, you've caught a little of what made him who he was. But here's the thing. This isn't just a story about him. It's about you too, because you don't have to ride across Asia to carry the Mongol spirit. You don't need a saddle to show courage. You don't need to wear armor to protect what you love. Baatar's life was one long act of service to his people, to his land, to his own sense of right. And in the end, that's something we all understand, even now, even here. We all want to matter, to be remembered, not as noise, but as something solid, lasting, not loud, just clear, like a hoof print that doesn't fade when the wind blows. So if you're listening to this beneath a night sky, or walking through your own kind of storm, or trying to find the next right step, remember this. The Mongol Empire didn't last, but its lessons did. And somewhere out there, in the hush between heartbeats and headlines, a quiet warrior still rides, not for glory, not for conquest, but for the silence that comes after, the kind that feels like home. They say that if you wake before the sun, before the crows, before the market stirs, before even the dogs have stretched, and you walk alone to the edge of the steppe, you might see him. just for a moment. Not clearly, not in focus, not enough to make you call out or run, but enough to feel it. The flicker of movement in the fog. A rider, not fast, not loud, just steady, just there. And if you listen carefully, if the world around you stops just long enough, you might hear a soft creak of leather, the breath of a calm horse, the whisper of wind against a bowstring long since unstrung. Some say it's a dream. Others say it's a story passed down too many times to be real. But a few believe it's Baatar, still riding, not because he has to, not because he's chasing war or glory, but because the land remembers him, because something in the sky still holds his name, because not all riders are meant to stop. So the next time your path feels uncertain, when the map makes no sense and your compass won't settle, just close your eyes, breathe, listen, and ride on, because he's already ahead of you, clearing the way, one hoofprint at a time. You made it. Whether you listened all at once or came back in pieces, this story held you, and maybe, just maybe, something in it stayed with you. This wasn't just a history lesson, it was a life, a voice, a whisper from a time when the world was broader, quieter, and infinitely wilder. You didn't just learn about Baatar, you rode with him, and in a world where noise is endless and silence is rare, maybe that's what we need most, a reminder that power doesn't always come from shouting, or from titles, or even from swords. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to ride and when to stop. So thank you for listening, for imagining, for remembering. And if you ever find yourself lost on the steppe or in your own life, just recall this. We are not the storm. We're the wind before it and the quiet after. Ride on.